Marcus Vale had always been told he was too smart for his own good. Standing in the assembly hall of the Galactic Military Academy, surrounded by beings that could literally tear him limb from limb with their breakfast appendages, he was starting to think those people might have had a point. "Welcome, cadets, to your final examination," Commander Grex announced, his reptilian voice echoing through the chamber like nails on a chalkboard. The Saurian's yellow eyes swept across the room, lingering on Marcus with what could only be described as professional skepticism. The no-weapons combat trial separates the warriors from the, well, let's just say it separates them. Marcus glanced around at his fellow cadets. To his left stood Thorax, a Krongan whose species had evolved from something that probably ate rocks for fun. The guy was built like a walking tank with anger management issues, and his idea of strategy involved hitting things until they stopped moving. His forearms flexed unconsciously as Grex spoke, each one capable of crushing Marcus's skull like a particularly disappointing grape. On his right, Zephyr floated slightly above her seat, her translucent Velani form shimmering with barely contained psychic energy. The telepathic species was known for their elegant combat techniques and their insufferable habit of finishing your thoughts before you had them. She hadn't spoken to Marcus directly, but he could feel her amusement radiating off her like heat from a campfire. Apparently his chances of survival were hilarious to the psychic crowd. "The rules are simple," Grex continued, clearly enjoying the tension in the room. "You will be dropped on planet Dustrock with basic survival gear. No weapons, no technology beyond a communicator for emergency evacuation. Last cadet standing passes the trial and graduates with honors. The rest of you get to explain to your families why you're not cut out for galactic service." Marcus raised his hand. "Define weapons, sir." The room erupted in what passed for laughter among species that had never heard of comedy. Thorax's rumbling chuckle sounded like a landslide having a midlife crisis. "Anything manufactured for the purpose of harm, Vale," Grex replied, his tone suggesting he thought the question was adorable. "Which means your species' famous creativity with tools won't help you here. This is about raw survival instinct, something I'm told humans lack, right?" Because nothing said survival instinct like being the only species in the galaxy that had figured out how to make friends with their planet's apex predators, and then ride them into battle. But Marcus kept that observation to himself. Let them underestimate the squishy human. It wouldn't be the first time that strategy had paid off. "Transport leaves in 1 hour," Grex announced. "I suggest you make peace with whatever deities you worship. Some of you won't be coming back." As the other cadets filed out, chattering excitedly in various clicks, growls and harmonic frequencies about their combat strategies, Marcus lingered behind. He wasn't worried about the fighting. He was worried about the not fighting. Because if there was one thing humans had learned in their brief but eventful history of galactic relations, it was that sometimes the best way to win a fight was to make sure it never happened in the first place. The trick was convincing everyone else that you were still fighting. Planet Dustrock lived up to its name with all the enthusiasm of a geological survey gone wrong. The transport ship's doors hissed open, revealing a landscape that looked like someone had taken Mars and decided it needed to be more depressing. Red dust stretched to the horizon, broken only by scattered boulders, the occasional scraggly bush that had clearly given up on life, and rock formations that seemed designed by a committee of pessimists. 48 hours, cadets, Grex's voice crackled through their communicators as they stepped onto the planet's surface. The elimination zone shrinks every 12 hours. Stay inside the boundaries or face automatic disqualification. Last one conscious wins. Marcus shouldered his survival pack, which contained the bare essentials: water purification tablets, emergency rations, a sleeping bag that was probably older than his home planet's democracy, and a first aid kit that looked like it had been assembled by someone who had heard of medicine but never actually seen it practiced. Around him, the other cadets were already sizing each other up like buyers at a particularly violent livestock auction. Thorax cracked his knuckles, a sound like breaking concrete, and began surveying the terrain for tactical advantages. Several of the smaller species immediately started forming alliances, their various languages creating a babble of nervous energy. Zephyr drifted past Marcus, her psychic aura shimmering with amusement. "Scared yet, human?" she asked, though her voice seemed to come from inside his own head. The telepathic communication was unsettling, like having someone rearrange your mental furniture without asking. "Terrified," Marcus replied cheerfully, bending down to pick up a smooth egg-sized rock. He examined it carefully, turning it over in his hands as if it contained the secrets of the universe. "This is a nice one." "A nice what?" Zephyr's confusion was palpable, even through the psychic link. "Rock," Marcus said, tucking it into his pocket. "Good weight, decent balance. Probably igneous, which means it's sturdy." The Vellani stared at him for a moment, her translucent features shifting through what Marcus assumed were expressions of bewilderment. Then she floated away, her psychic laughter trailing behind her like cosmic background radiation. As the other cadets dispersed across the landscape, Marcus continued his apparently random rock collection, occasionally holding stones up to the light, or tapping them together to test their density. To any observer, he looked like a geology student who had wandered into the wrong final exam. Thorax stomped over, his massive frame casting a shadow that could have housed a small family. "What are you doing, little human?" "Rock hunting," Marcus replied, adding a particularly angular piece of granite to his growing collection. "With rocks." Thorax's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a display of confusion that was almost endearing if you ignored the part where he could probably bench press a starship. "Well, they're not going to hunt themselves," Marcus said reasonably. The Krongan shook his massive head and lumbered away, muttering something in his native language that probably translated to questioning the wisdom of allowing humans into advanced education. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the dusty landscape in shades of amber and regret, Marcus had managed to collect nearly 20 rocks of various sizes and compositions. His fellow cadets had spent the time sharpening claws, practicing combat stances, and forming strategic alliances. None of them seemed particularly worried about the human who was apparently planning to defeat them with a geology lesson. As night fell on Dustrock, the temperature dropped faster than Marcus's reputation among his instructors. The other cadets had scattered across the landscape, each implementing their species' time-tested approach to not dying horribly. Thorax had claimed a rocky outcropping that gave him a commanding view of the surrounding terrain. The Krongan's forearms worked with methodical precision, filing his natural claws against the rough stone until they gleamed like surgical instruments in the alien starlight. His species had conquered 17 star systems using nothing but brute force and an impressive talent for breaking things, so his strategy was refreshingly straightforward: find enemy, apply claws until enemy stopped being a problem. Meanwhile, Zephyr had positioned herself near a cluster of mineral formations that amplified psychic energy. She floated in a meditative pose, her translucent form pulsing with waves of mental power as she practiced what the Vellani called combat meditation. This involved reaching into her opponents' minds and convincing their nervous systems that pain was actually quite fashionable this season. It was elegant, efficient, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who valued their brain chemistry. The Helix twins, a pair of insectoid cadets from the Chitnus Collective, had begun weaving what looked like a web between 2 standing stones. Their 6 arms moved in perfect synchronization, creating a trap that could ensnare anything smaller than a transport shuttle. They chittered to each other in their native language, probably discussing the nutritional value of their fellow cadets. Down by a dried riverbed, 3 of the more diplomatically inclined species had formed an alliance. The crystalline delegate was using her natural ability to resonate with stone to create crude but effective bludgeoning tools. The gaseous representative had taken a more subtle approach, seeping into the ground to create pockets of noxious vapor that would incapacitate anyone who wandered too close. And the mechanical cadet, whose people had replaced most of their organic parts with superior technology, was fashioning spears from salvaged metal components he'd somehow extracted from his own body. All very traditional, all very predictable, all completely missing the point. Marcus, meanwhile, had found himself a cozy little depression between 2 large boulders that provided excellent cover from multiple angles. To anyone watching, it looked like he was hiding, and in a sense he was. But while his fellow cadets were busy preparing to fight each other, Marcus was busy preparing the battlefield itself. His rock collection had grown considerably: smooth river stones for precision work, jagged granite chunks for maximum impact, dense metallic meteorite fragments that would hit like guided missiles. But the real masterpiece was what he was doing with them. Marcus had always been good at physics. Not the theoretical kind that got you invited to fancy academic conferences, but the practical kind that helped you understand exactly how much force you needed to apply to make something very heavy fall on something very annoying. He'd spent his childhood building increasingly elaborate domino runs and Rube Goldberg machines, much to his parents' dismay and the neighborhood cat's terror. Now, as he carefully balanced a basketball-sized boulder on a precarious pile of smaller stones, he felt that same familiar thrill. The balance point was perfect. The slightest disturbance would send the whole thing cascading down the slope, and anyone standing in the wrong place would find themselves dealing with several tons of accelerating geology. But that was just the appetizer. Using a combination of leverage, counterweights, and what his engineering professors would have called inspired stupidity, Marcus had spent the evening turning his little corner of Dustrock into a mechanical nightmare. Tripwires made from unraveled threads from his sleeping bag, pressure plates created by balancing flat rocks on carefully placed fulcrums, deadfall traps that would make a medieval siege engineer weep with joy. The best part was that none of it looked like anything. To a casual observer, Marcus had simply arranged some rocks in a vaguely aesthetic pattern around his campsite. The kind of thing a stressed human might do to feel more at home on an alien world. Completely harmless. Totally innocent. Absolutely devastating if you happen to step in the wrong place. As the first night wore on, Marcus could hear his fellow cadets moving through the darkness. Thorax's heavy footsteps as he patrolled his territory. The whispered communications of the Alliance members coordinating their strategy. Zephyr's psychic presence as she scanned the area for threats. None of them were scanning for carefully arranged piles of rocks. Why would they? Rocks didn't fight back. Rocks weren't dangerous. Rocks were just part of the landscape. Marcus smiled in the darkness and made a few final adjustments to his masterpiece. By morning, his fellow cadets would learn that sometimes the landscape fights back harder than you expect. Dawn on Dustrock arrived with all the subtlety of a Krongan diplomatic mission. The binary suns crested the horizon, painting the landscape in harsh reds and golds, and Marcus could hear his fellow cadets beginning to stir from their various defensive positions. The real elimination round was about to begin. The first victim was entirely predictable. Cadet Apex, a predator-class being, whose species had evolved from something that had clearly skipped the thinking part of evolution in favor of really good at biting things, came charging down the slope toward Marcus's position with all the tactical finesse of a meteor impact. His natural camouflage flickered as he moved, but stealth was apparently less important to him than the traditional predator approach of running directly at your prey while making intimidating noises. Marcus didn't even have to move. Apex's massive clawed foot came down squarely on what looked like a randomly placed flat stone. The rock tilted under his weight, triggering a cascade that would have made Archimedes weep with pride. The counterweight system Marcus had spent half the night perfecting released a boulder the size of a small shuttle, which proceeded to roll down the slope with all the enthusiasm of gravity itself. Apex looked up just in time to see several tons of igneous rock bearing down on him with the kind of inevitability usually reserved for tax collection. His species might have been apex predators on their homeworld, but they had apparently never developed an evolutionary response to giant rolling boulder. The impact sent him tumbling down the hillside, like a very large, very surprised pinball. His communicator activated automatically when he hit unconscious, broadcasting his elimination to the remaining cadets and providing Marcus with his first official victory. One down, Marcus muttered, watching the medical drone swoop in to collect the stunned predator. 17 to go. The elimination had an immediate effect on the other cadets. The casual confidence that had characterized the first night evaporated faster than water on Dustrock's surface. Suddenly, everyone was moving more carefully. Eyes scanning not just for other cadets, but for potential environmental hazards. Unfortunately for them, Marcus had anticipated this. The Helix twins were the next to discover the joys of human engineering. They came scuttling across the rocky terrain in perfect synchronization, their 6 legs moving in a complex pattern that should have allowed them to navigate any natural obstacle. Their mistake was assuming that Marcus's carefully arranged stone garden was natural. The pressure plate they triggered was a work of art. A thin slab of stone balanced on a fulcrum, designed to tip the moment anything heavier than a small rodent stepped on it. The twins' combined weight sent the lever system into motion, releasing a net of unraveled fabric that Marcus had weighted with rocks and suspended between 2 carefully positioned boulders. The Helix twins found themselves wrapped up like a very surprised package, their synchronized movements now working against them as they struggled in perfect, useless harmony. Their chittering rose to a panicked frequency before their communicators mercifully activated, signaling their elimination. Physics, Marcus said conversationally to nobody in particular. It's not just a good idea, it's the law. By mid-morning, word had spread among the remaining cadets that something was very wrong with the terrain around the humans' position. What had started as confident hunting parties approaching Marcus's location had turned into careful reconnaissance missions that kept getting interrupted by sudden geological events. The crystalline delegate learned this lesson when she tried to use her species' natural resonance abilities to scan the area for threats. Her harmonic probing triggered a series of carefully balanced stones that had been tuned to specific frequencies. The resulting rock slide was small by planetary standards, but more than sufficient to bury one confused mineral-based life form up to her shoulders in rubble. Elimination by sedimentary deposit, Marcus noted, adding another tally to his mental scoreboard. That's got to be a first. The gaseous representative's elimination was perhaps the most elegant. His species' ability to seep through small spaces and create toxic clouds made him a formidable opponent in normal circumstances. Unfortunately, Marcus had spent considerable time creating circumstances that were anything but normal. The vapor-based cadet had attempted to infiltrate Marcus's position by seeping through the gaps between rocks. What he didn't realize was that Marcus had spent hours arranging those gaps to function as a massive pneumatic system. When the gaseous representative compressed himself to fit through the first opening, he triggered a chain reaction that used his own pressure to activate a series of one-way valves Marcus had crafted from hollow stones and flexible plant fibers. The result was that the gaseous cadet found himself compressed into a space roughly the size of a lunchbox, where he remained trapped until his communicator activated from the stress of involuntary molecular compression. Boyle's law, Marcus explained to the medical drone as it arrived to collect the compressed cadet. It's surprisingly applicable to non-standard life forms. By noon the elimination zone had shrunk according to schedule, forcing the remaining cadets closer together. Marcus's position, which had seemed disadvantageous at the start, was now perfectly centered in the safe zone. Pure coincidence, of course. Except for the part where Marcus had studied the terrain maps for weeks and calculated exactly where the final boundaries would be drawn. The remaining cadets were starting to show signs of serious concern. What had begun as a straightforward combat trial had turned into something resembling an elaborate practical joke being played by the universe itself. Every approach to the human's position seemed to result in some new and creative form of geological mishap. Thorax stood at the edge of the elimination zone, his forearms crossed as he studied Marcus's position with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for defusing explosives. The Krongan might have preferred the direct approach, but he wasn't stupid. Something was very wrong with the rocks around the human, and Thorax was beginning to suspect that the wrongness was entirely intentional. Zephyr floated nearby, her psychic senses probing the area around Marcus's camp. What she found confused her even more than Thorax's visual analysis. The human's mind was calm, almost cheerful, with none of the combat stress she expected from someone who had just eliminated half the competition. Instead she detected what felt like the mental signature of someone solving a particularly enjoyable puzzle. "He's not fighting," Zephyr said, her voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "He's playing." Thorax's rumbling laughter had an edge of nervous uncertainty. "Playing with what? Rocks?" "Playing with us," Zephyr replied, and for the first time since the trial began, her psychic confidence wavered. In his rock garden, Marcus was making final preparations for the endgame. The remaining cadets were exactly where he wanted them, positioned around his location like pieces on a chessboard. All that remained was to invite them in for the final move. He stood up from his concealed position and waved cheerfully at Thorax and Zephyr. "Hey there," he called out. "Ready for the finale?" The invitation hung in the air like a challenge wrapped in politeness and tied with a bow of impending doom. Thorax and Zephyr exchanged what passed for meaningful looks between a four-armed mountain of muscle and a floating translucent psychic entity. In the span of 12 hours, they had watched their fellow cadets fall victim to what could only be described as aggressive landscaping, and now the human was actually inviting them to come closer. "This has to be a trap," Thorax rumbled, his deep voice carrying across the rocky terrain like distant thunder. "Of course it's a trap," Zephyr replied, her psychic voice tinged with something that might have been admiration. "The question is whether we're clever enough to avoid it." Marcus, meanwhile, was making what appeared to be final adjustments to his rock arrangements. To the casual observer, he looked like someone tidying up a campsite. To anyone who had been paying attention for the last 12 hours, he looked like someone fine-tuning a doomsday device made entirely of geological materials. "You know," Marcus called out conversationally, "my species has a saying, if you can't join them, beat them. But I've always preferred the corollary, if you can't beat them, rearrange their environment until beating becomes unnecessary." Thorax's four eyes narrowed in sequence. "What does that even mean?" "It means," Marcus said, picking up a perfectly ordinary-looking stone and examining it thoughtfully, "that I've spent the last day turning this entire area into the galaxy's most elaborate Rube Goldberg machine, and you two are about to become the ball bearings." The Krongan's response was predictably direct. With a roar that probably registered on seismic equipment halfway across the planet, Thorax charged down the slope toward Marcus's position. His massive frame moved with surprising speed, for something that looked like it had been assembled from spare starship parts and powered by pure stubbornness. Zephyr followed, but with considerably more caution. Her psychic senses were screaming warnings about the terrain ahead, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong. The rocks looked like rocks. The ground looked like ground. Everything appeared perfectly normal, which was exactly what made it so terrifying. Marcus watched them approach with the calm satisfaction of an engineer whose calculations were about to be tested under real-world conditions. Thorax was taking the direct route, as expected. Zephyr was following a more circuitous path, trying to use her psychic senses to avoid whatever traps lay ahead. Both approaches were exactly what Marcus had planned for. The first phase of the master trap activated when Thorax stepped on what looked like solid ground but was actually a thin layer of stone supported by carefully arranged pebbles. The false floor collapsed under his weight, dropping the massive Krongan into a pit that Marcus had spent hours excavating and camouflaging. But this wasn't just any pit. This was a pit with a purpose. The bottom was lined with smooth, round stones that provided no traction whatsoever. The walls were angled inward just enough to make climbing impossible for someone with Thorax's bulk. And most importantly, the pit was positioned directly beneath a carefully balanced boulder the size of a small building. Thorax's impact on the pit floor triggered a secondary mechanism. A lever system made from strategically placed stones and the elastic fibers from Marcus's dismantled sleeping bag. The lever released a counterweight, which in turn activated a series of pulleys crafted from round stones and unraveled fabric threads. The massive boulder above the pit began to move. "Oh, come on," Thorax bellowed from the bottom of the pit, looking up to see several tons of rock descending toward him with all the inevitability of a Vogon poetry reading. "This is just showing off." But Marcus wasn't done. The boulder's descent was carefully controlled by his pulley system, designed not to crush the Krongan but to plug the pit like a cork in a bottle. Thorax found himself trapped in a stone chamber with just enough room to be thoroughly annoyed, but not enough to do anything about it. "Elimination by geological imprisonment," Marcus announced cheerfully. "I'm definitely putting that one on my resume." Thorax's elimination left only Zephyr, who had been forced to watch the entire display while trying to navigate her own path through Marcus's mineral minefield. Her psychic abilities were considerably more sophisticated than brute force tunnel vision, but they were also proving to be her downfall. The problem with telepathic species was that they relied heavily on reading their opponent's intentions. Zephyr had been trying to predict Marcus's next move by scanning his surface thoughts, but what she found there was utterly baffling. The human's mind was focused entirely on physics equations, engineering principles, and what appeared to be a mental catalog of rock density measurements. There was no combat strategy, no tactical planning, no thoughts of victory or defeat, just an overwhelming enthusiasm for applied mechanics, and an almost childlike delight in watching his contraptions work exactly as designed. "You're insane," Zephyr said, her psychic voice carrying a note of genuine bewilderment. "I prefer creatively practical," Marcus replied, making a final adjustment to a balance point that looked suspiciously like a catapult made entirely of stones and plant fibers. "But I'll take insane if it comes with a passing grade." Zephyr's approach was more cautious than Thorax's charge, but caution couldn't save her from the masterpiece Marcus had prepared for the finale. The Veilani's natural ability to float above the ground meant she could avoid most of the pressure plates and tripwires that had claimed the other cadets. What she couldn't avoid was Marcus's understanding of three-dimensional physics. As Zephyr drifted toward Marcus's position, staying carefully above what she assumed were ground-based traps, she triggered the final mechanism. A web of nearly invisible plant fibers stretched between the standing stones at various heights, designed to catch something moving through the air rather than along the ground. The fibers were connected to a counterweight system that made Marcus's previous contraptions look simple by comparison. When Zephyr's psychic form broke the first strand, it activated a cascade of balanced stones that had been arranged in a precise sequence around the entire clearing. The result was a three-dimensional cage that materialized around the floating Veilani faster than her psychic reflexes could react. Stone slabs supported by perfectly calculated fulcrums swung closed like the petals of a geometric flower, creating a prison that trapped Zephyr in a sphere of her own confusion. "How?" she asked, her psychic voice muffled by several tons of artistically arranged geology. Marcus walked over to the stone sphere and patted it affectionately. "Leverage, momentum, and a really unhealthy obsession with making things fall over in exactly the right sequence. Plus I may have spent my childhood building elaborate traps for the neighborhood squirrels. The squirrels, they kept getting into my mother's bird feeder," Marcus explained reasonably. "I consider this a natural progression of that skill set." Inside her stone prison, Zephyr's communicator activated automatically, signaling her elimination and Marcus's victory in the trial. The sound echoed across the now quiet battlefield, where the only movement came from medical drones collecting the various eliminated cadets and Commander Grex's transport ship descending from orbit. Marcus looked around at his rock garden, now thoroughly rearranged by the activation of his various mechanisms. It looked like a geological disaster zone had collided with an engineering textbook and somehow produced art. "You know," he said to nobody in particular, "I think I'm really going to like it here." The transport ship's landing thrusters kicked up clouds of red dust as Commander Grex's vessel touched down in the middle of what had once been a perfectly ordinary patch of dust rock terrain and was now something that looked like abstract art had gotten into a fight with a physics textbook and lost spectacularly. Grex emerged from the ship with the measured gait of someone who had seen enough military disasters to recognize when something had gone very, very differently than planned. His reptilian features were arranged in an expression that suggested he was trying to process information that his brain was actively rejecting as impossible. Behind him came a collection of academy instructors representing various species, all wearing the universal expression of educators who had just watched their carefully planned curriculum get turned inside out by a student they had consistently underestimated. Professor Klix, the hegemony's foremost expert on combat tactics, was making notes on a datapad with the frantic energy of someone whose entire worldview was being rewritten in real time. "Cadet Vale," Commander Grex said, his voice carrying the tone of someone who wasn't entirely sure he was addressing a student or some kind of geological phenomenon that had achieved sentience. "Would you care to explain what exactly happened here?" Marcus looked around at the transformed landscape. Stones that had been carefully balanced were now scattered in precise patterns. Boulders that had started the trial in one location were now firmly planted in completely different locations, usually on top of or around various eliminated cadets. The entire area looked like someone had taken a normal piece of terrain and run it through a machine designed to make rocks more interesting. "Well," Marcus said, brushing dust off his hands with the satisfaction of someone who had just completed a particularly satisfying home improvement project, "I won." "Yes," Grex said slowly, "we gathered that from the elimination signals. What we're trying to understand is how you won without actually fighting anyone." "Who says I didn't fight?" Marcus asked, looking genuinely puzzled. "I fought physics. I fought engineering challenges. I fought the fundamental problem of making 17 different things fall over in exactly the right sequence. Just because I didn't punch anyone doesn't mean there wasn't a fight." Professor Klix looked up from her datapad. "The tactical analysis of your approach is unprecedented. You turned the entire battlefield into a weapon system. The complexity of the mechanical interactions alone suggests a level of strategic thinking that we haven't seen from any species in the Galactic Academy's history." "Really?" Marcus seemed pleased by this assessment. "Because I was mostly just trying not to get eaten by thorax. Have you seen the size of that guy's teeth? I'm pretty sure he could bite through a shuttle hull." Dr. Nexus, the Academy's chief psychologist, stepped forward. Her species resembled something like a cross between a butterfly and a filing cabinet, and her compound eyes were reflecting the kind of fascination usually reserved for discovering new forms of mathematics. "The psychological profile here is remarkable," she said, her voice carrying harmonic overtones that suggested deep analysis. "Most cadets approach the combat trial with aggressive intent. You approached it as an engineering problem. You weren't trying to defeat your opponents so much as rearrange them." "Exactly," Marcus said, pointing at Dr. Nexus with the enthusiasm of someone who had finally found someone who understood his homework. "Fighting is inefficient. It requires you to be in the same place as the thing you're trying to stop, which is usually the most dangerous place to be. Much better to arrange things so that the problem solves itself." Commander Grex was studying a tactical display that showed the sequence of eliminations throughout the trial. The pattern was unlike anything in the Academy's extensive database of combat scenarios. Instead of the usual chaotic swirl of direct confrontations, the display showed a series of precisely timed events radiating out from Marcus's position like ripples in a pond. "The trap systems you constructed," Grex said, his tone shifting from bewilderment to something approaching professional respect, "they're not just mechanically sophisticated. They're psychologically sophisticated. You anticipated not just where your opponents would be but how they would think and react." "Well, yeah," Marcus said, as if this was the most obvious thing in the galaxy. "Thorax was always going to charge straight at whatever looked like a threat. That's what his species does. Zephyr was always going to try to use her psychic abilities to avoid ground-based traps, so she'd be thinking three-dimensionally. The Helix twins move in perfect synchronization, which means anything that works on one of them works on both of them simultaneously." He gestured toward the various trap locations scattered around the battlefield. Once you understand how someone thinks, it's just a matter of engineering a situation where their natural instincts work against them instead of for them. The academy instructors exchanged glances that carried the weight of professional educators realizing they had been teaching the subject completely wrong for several decades. Cadet Vale. Professor Click said, her voice carefully controlled, in all our tactical databases, there is no record of anyone winning a combat trial without engaging in direct physical confrontation with at least one opponent. Huh, Marcus said, considering this, that's probably because most people think combat means hitting things until they stop moving. But really, combat is just problem solving with higher stakes, and the best way to solve a problem is usually to change the parameters until the problem solves itself. Dr. Nexus was practically vibrating with academic excitement. This approach could revolutionize our understanding of tactical thinking. Instead of training cadets to be better fighters, we could be training them to be better environmental manipulators. Landscape architects, Marcus suggested helpfully, with a specialty in aggressive geology. Commander Grex had been quiet for several minutes, studying both the battlefield analysis and Marcus himself with the careful attention of someone recalibrating their entire understanding of military strategy. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been admiration. Cadet Vale, in 40 years of military service, I have never seen anything like what you accomplished here today. You have demonstrated a form of tactical thinking that is completely unprecedented in galactic military history. Marcus shuffled his feet, suddenly looking uncomfortable with the praise. It really wasn't that complicated. I'm not very good at the whole punching people thing. Never have been. But I'm pretty good at making things work the way I want them to work. So I figured why not make the battlefield work for me instead of against me. The Academy's combat instructors are going to want to study your methods, Grex continued. This could change how we approach tactical training for all species. Sure, Marcus said agreeably. But can I make one request? What's that, Cadet? Marcus grinned, and for a moment he looked less like a revolutionary tactical genius and more like a college student who had just aced a test he hadn't studied for. Next time, can we do this somewhere with less dust? I think I'm going to be picking red sand out of my equipment for the next 6 months. As the medical drones finished collecting the various eliminated cadets and the transport ship prepared for departure, Commander Grex found himself looking back at the transformed battlefield with something approaching awe. In the space of 48 hours, one human cadet had taken everything the Academy thought it knew about combat and turned it upside down with nothing more than some rocks and a comprehensive understanding of physics. The implications were staggering. If humans could approach warfare as an engineering problem rather than a contest of strength, what did that mean for the future of galactic military doctrine? What did it mean for species that had built their entire civilizations around the assumption that the strongest fighter wins? More importantly, what did it mean for a galaxy that was about to discover that humans didn't just think outside the box, they redesigned the box, rebuilt it with better materials, and then used it to solve problems nobody else had even recognized as problems? As the transport lifted off from Dustrock, leaving behind a landscape that would probably be studied by xenogeologists for the next century, Marcus settled back into his seat with the satisfied expression of someone who had just passed his final exam in a subject he had accidentally invented. So, he said to nobody in particular, "What's next?" The answer to that question, Commander Grex reflected, was probably going to be very interesting indeed.